Good morning, everybody, and I'm going to talk to you this morning about the National Strategy for the Construction Sector, which was published earlier this year. And I suppose before I just get into that, I'll just briefly explain what Forfás is. We're an agency of the Department of Jobs, Enterprise and Innovation, and our main focus is to develop evidence and provide evidence-based policy advice to government on a range of areas of relevance to enterprise development and growth in Ireland. We work very closely with our sister agencies, IDA Ireland, who has responsibility for foreign direct investment, Enterprise Ireland, who has responsibility for Indigenous enterprise development, and Science Foundation Ireland, who has responsibility for developing capability in the research base in Ireland. We work very closely with those agencies in the course of our work. We also provide research and policy support to a number of government bodies, advisory bodies, including the National Competitiveness Council and also the Expert Group on Future Skills Needs. I suppose in relation to the strategy, we commenced the strategy, I suppose, in the middle of last year, and we set out in a context of exceptional negativity about the future of the sector. Not only were we at a very low point in terms of activity levels and job losses, and to some extent that remains with us, the sector had also lost considerable ground in terms of its reputation and professionalism. But at the same time, despite those serious challenges facing the sector, there was a sense amongst stakeholders at the time that as we embarked upon the work, the process offered an opportunity to regroup and to revisit where we're at and see what could be done in that context. Preparation of the strategy was an ask of government under the Action Plan for Jobs in 2012. We adopted a highly consultative approach throughout the process, and I suppose overall I think an important shift was made as a result of the process towards looking to the future and looking towards the future development of the sector in Ireland. An important message that the process has allowed us to re-emphasise at an aspect that's not always recognised, I think, when we talk about construction, is that it has a really important dual role in the economy. Not only does it have a direct role in creating regionally distributed jobs and contribute value generation to the economy, it's also a hugely important factor in the broader competitiveness equation for the Irish economy and the business environment generally, because obviously construction provides the buildings and infrastructure on which every other sector of the economy depends. So we need a competitive and viable sector to fulfil this dual role. The data for the past number of years is of course very stark, and we're very familiar with it. Direct employment has more than halved since the peak in 2007, and output has contracted to about a quarter of an unsustainably high peak of 24.6% of GNP in 2006. Despite that massive contraction, the sector still contributes very substantially to the economy at the present time, both in terms of direct and indirect employment and in terms of output, and is capable of contributing more. The bulk of the firms in the sector are focused on the domestic market, but I suppose that's no different to other advanced economies. There is a growing internationalised element within the Irish sector, and there is greater potential for more from activity overseas. As I said earlier, the process of preparing the strategy with stakeholders was an opportunity to regroup and look towards a more positive future for the sector in Ireland, and we articulated the ambition in these terms on the slide. I won't go through all the points there, but I suppose underpinning all of those aspects was an aspiration for a new level of professionalism, a more measured response to real and substantiated demand, and a very close eye on capability and innovation leadership. A key part of the strategy was to undertake an assessment of outlook and potential for the sector and the domestic market over the period to 2015. A very short period indeed, but I suppose an acknowledgement of the challenges at the time, but also an acknowledgement that it's very difficult to predict with accuracy beyond that time frame. Fundamentally, the strategy is about sustaining and growing the sector over the longer term. We looked at three things as part of the assessment of outlook and potential, looking at domestic activity in the first instance and the sources of sustainable demand across private residential housing, private non-residential or commercial construction, and also public capital investment. And in projecting those levels of demand, we painted as realistic a picture as possible based on known or anticipated areas of demand for construction services over the period to 2015. We engaged the services of DKM Economic Consultants to help us with this analysis. And in addition to that, we also asked what constitutes a sustainable level of demand in the domestic market for Ireland. We also looked at the potential for further internationalisation, bearing in mind capacity and capability challenges, and that, I suppose, opportunities will arise primarily in specialised niche areas. Potential in this area is difficult to quantify, but it is there. We then looked at factors influencing change in the sector on a global level and the implications of these for the Irish sector's competitiveness and capabilities looking into the future. So our projections for the domestic market, overall they indicated a very slow recovery and I suppose the scale of the challenge. Very little difference in overall output between 2012 and 2015 as the figures show there. And from an employment point of view, I suppose the reality that those forecasts indicated that any substantive recovery in employment terms was unlikely over the time frame. That's how the projection looked like in graphical terms and I suppose the severe scaling back of activity. Barely positive, but indicating perhaps the beginnings of an upward trend nonetheless. So there's no doubt about the scale of the challenge, and our output projections indicate that the sector is operating and will continue to operate at a suboptimal level for some time. Comparison with other European countries and Ireland's past performance over a number of decades would indicate that Ireland should be capable of sustaining an output level of closer to 12% of GMP. And I suppose that shouldn't be considered necessarily as a target, but an indication of a more normal and sustainable level of output. So significantly above that would raise serious questions about sustainability, while significantly below level, which is where we're at the moment, raises serious questions about the erosion of skills, our expertise and the capacity to deliver, and in turn, therefore, a threat to our competitiveness. And we have to pay attention to the fact that we risk losing, for example, enterprise investment to other international locations if the right properties are not available or can't be delivered efficiently, or if the highest standards are difficult to deliver. So there is a significant gap to be bridged if the sector is to reach activity levels of up to 12% of GMP. It isn't going to happen by 2015, and as to when it is still quite unclear, and there's still many unknowns and a lot of uncertainties. But what we can do is to seek to accelerate the rate of recovery and, where possible, remove obstacles to the commencement of construction development that is backed by real demand, without intervening in the market to such an extent that is counterproductive. And I'll return to some of the obstacles in a moment. But I suppose at the present time there are positive indications that the outturn to 2015 could be somewhat better than the projections have shown. We are seeing continued strong performance in our exporting sectors, creating demand for high quality offices and industrial buildings. IDA Ireland had one of its best years ever in 2012, and the agency has talked about a pinch point in relation to the availability of high quality office accommodation, especially in Dublin. We've seen the National Asset Management Agency, NAMA, making developer financing available to stimulate the development and movement of property from its portfolio. Ireland continues to exhibit favourable demographics. The ESRI, in a recent analysis, indicated that actual real demand for new housing based on household formation is in the order of about 20,000 units per annum to 2016. But various factors continue to influence and delay individual decisions around establishing those new households. Currently, building is around 4,000 units per annum. It is encouraging that, I suppose, in that context, that data on mortgage approvals are up about 7.5% in the year to date, according to the CSO. It's also somewhat reassuring to see some positive signals in the housing market in terms of house prices. House prices are showing a recovery. Nationally 3.6% over the past year, and I suppose driven mainly by the Dublin region, where house prices have increased by about 12% in the last year. The Construction Purchasing Managers Index also shows some positive indications in terms of a rise in construction industry for the first time, activity for the first time since 2007, and it talks about business sentiment improving and a rise in new orders and stabilisation of employment. There's also a continuing need, of course, to invest in productive infrastructure, and if funding barriers can be overcome, there is potential for increased capital spending in this area by government in partnership with the private sector. And again, it's reassuring to hear about improved market sentiment in the context of public-private partnerships in terms of potential partner investors. And I suppose then, based on successes to date, overseas markets can contribute more to overall output. There are, of course, more companies operating in international markets now than before the crash, and it's important that we don't take our foot off the pedal, I suppose, in that respect, if there is to be recovery, a sustained recovery on the domestic front. And why is that? Well, it's not only about the potential foreign earnings and repatriated profits and tax revenues that can be generated from that type of activity. Competing in overseas markets raises the bar for construction companies in terms of their professionalism, competitiveness and capability. And that's not just for those directly involved, but also sub-suppliers and service providers associated with that activity. Greater internationalisation also provides a cushion against the reality of cyclical domestic demand. Since the downturn, Enterprise Ireland has seen its client companies make very good progress from a low base in terms of internationalisation, particularly in professional construction services. These are firms taking their expertise in specialist areas gained from sectors such as pharmaceuticals, power generation, data centres, etc., to markets in the UK, Europe, Middle East and beyond. And they're very often specialised niche services in civil and structural engineering, project management and design, and more can be achieved. And there's no doubt, of course, that the global marketplace is tough. It does involve a steep and risky learning curve, and that's often difficult to contemplate in today's challenging economic conditions. It also demands strong management capability and an ability to differentiate your offering. Competing internationally also means, at the very least, staying with the game in terms of innovation and work practices and ways of working. So the sector continues to evolve, and I suppose it is important to remember that while a return to sustainable demand levels and growth and activity is a key objective, that alone won't be enough to ensure the sector's future development and competitiveness. Globally, construction services and products and markets are changing in response to influential drivers. That's an important consideration not only for companies who are seeking to capture business overseas, but also those competing in the domestic context, where there's an increasing likelihood of competition from overseas, and a more sophisticated client is demanding higher environmental standards, increased efficiency and lower cost. So we're talking about here of technological advances, new materials, greater use of information technology, new ways of working, including wider utilisation, of course, of building information modelling, off-site construction, new business models. The green agenda, of course, continues to demand new products, new methods, new standards, requiring new skills and innovation, both from the private consumer and through the formal regulations. Fiscal constraints, of course, in Ireland and overseas are demanding efficiency and higher levels of productivity from the sector. So the sector in Ireland has to rise to these challenges and opportunities, not only to follow, but to be a standard setter internationally. So how do we go about accelerating recovery and getting back to a path of sustainable growth over the longer term? Through the course of our consultations and the preparation of the strategy, a number of issues and barriers were communicated to us, as well as things that needed to be done to prepare the sector for the future in an evolving global context. And I suppose these fall under three distinct pillars which require a response. And those are addressing low levels of confidence in the home market and uncertainty on the domestic front, removing constraints hindering development potential, and also focusing on key capability challenges and opportunities. And I suppose just to mention some of the areas without getting into a huge amount of detail here, in relation to generating more certainty and confidence, I suppose a lot of talk about the stop-start nature of the public capital programme due to economic difficulties, and that has added uncertainty to the market. I suppose it also has to be acknowledged that there is little government can do over the short term to bridge the gap created by the collapse in private sector building. It is a huge gap, but government still has a crucial role to play in ensuring that we continue to invest in productive infrastructure to underpin economic recovery. Deferrals and unpredictability are harmful for our reputation internationally, and they're harmful to the construction sector. So what has been prioritised now for delivery needs to proceed without unnecessary delay. We need also to make sure that where there is demand for construction, that constraints on development are removed. There are a number of difficulties, for example, associated with the current public government contract, creating delays and unnecessary costs for construction firms and also the state. A review of that contract and process is important to ensure it is fit for purpose. An efficient and effective and consistent planning system is in everyone's interest. And while much has been done to address legacy issues here, there needs to be a continued focus on removing uncertainty, delays and inconsistencies from the system that will also support recovery and development where there is demand. The ongoing review of the development management guidelines is very important in that respect. Then on capability, I talked earlier about continuing change in the sector and about getting more from overseas, and that creates an urgent and live skills agenda that needs to progress. Continuous professional development and upskilling so that the sector can respond to new market demands at home and overseas, particularly in relation to the green economy and management development. It also involves adequate preparation for an evolving sector at undergraduate level and through a flexible apprenticeship system, particularly as activity begins to grow again. There's also a need for greater awareness and engagement by enterprises with new technologies, materials and ways of working. The market is increasingly demanding leading-edge processes and technology. The construction sector in Ireland needs to be adequately prepared to deliver if it is to remain competitive. So we developed 36 action points over 5 areas, and I suppose it's important to realise that we saw this as the commencement of a rolling agenda of actions rather than a finite one. And there was a strong balance then between concerns associated with addressing current market conditions and confidence in the market and restoring confidence and certainty, alongside the hugely important objective of looking at the developmental needs and imperative for the sector looking to the longer term, the whole area of reinforcing capability. I have left copies of the report available here at the conference, and you can also find it on our website, so I won't take you through all of those actions. I'll just highlight a few of the actions over the next couple of slides. So in relation to removing constraints and restoring certainty and confidence, in relation to the public capital programme, for example, we've recommended that where investment is committed, that of course it proceeds without delay, and where financing options are secured, where new financing has been identified, that additional productive infrastructure would be prioritised. Again, focusing on encouraging confidence and to address some financial constraints impeding development where demand is there. One of the areas we highlighted was in relation to ensuring that there are appropriate financing mechanisms available to support foreign direct investment related construction needs which are apparent at the present time and need to be delivered. It's also very important to continue to communicate the strategy, the National Asset Management Agency strategy, to help provide certainty in the market. Again, in the context of addressing constraints and delays, we have recommended that a review of the current government contract would be implemented, and that any necessary changes would be undertaken to ensure fair and reasonable terms for all parties, while still securing price certainty and quality. On the planning system, very important that forward planning is very much part of the planning system. Again, to instill certainty and predictability within the development going forward. In terms of driving further internationalisation, this is a case of, I suppose, building on very good progress to date and accelerating that progress. And in terms of building on the work of Enterprise Ireland in a couple of areas, in terms of promoting increased participation in client management development programmes, and also, for example, increased construction sector involvement in Enterprise Ireland's marketing sales strategy review process, and a number of other actions in that respect as well. In the area of embedding competitiveness and innovation, we've looked at cost competitiveness, we've highlighted development levies, and perhaps a need to seriously look at time-bound waivers or reductions in local authority development levies. On innovation and leadership, again, it's very important to see greater take-up of Enterprise Ireland's lean programme from within the construction sector, and also to work very closely with industry organisations to promote more extensive take-up and use of building information modelling, including upskilling and capability building in that area. The shadow economy was a strong theme amongst stakeholders, and quite a lot of progress has been made in this area in terms of improving and enhanced cooperation between the Revenue, Department of Social Protection and the National Employment Rights Agency. But alongside all of that, we would recommend that there would be greater effort put into public awareness in terms of communicating the harmful impacts of private individuals dealing with shadow economy operators in the construction sector. In relation to skills, we highlighted the apprenticeship model. There's a review has commenced of the apprenticeship model, and it's critically important that that review results in a model with an appropriate level of flexibility to provide for future needs and to accommodate the cyclical nature of the sector. Also important at third level to include compulsory international business and government tendering models within third level education programmes. And again, there's a number of actions under skills development. And then finally, to ensure progress on all of the actions and a continued focus on accelerating recovery and sustainable growth in construction. There is a critical need for a more positive and productive relationship between the sector and the government system. It is a fact that the relationship is fragmented across government departments, and there's no, I suppose, one go-to place in government for the industry to engage with government. In some respects, that is a necessary evil, but it's also the case that the focus of the relationship generally has been more about regulation than, I suppose, future-focused developmental agenda. So in that context, we recommended the establishment of a construction enterprise clearinghouse. Again, not a case of shifting responsibilities between government departments, but achieving a more coordinated approach and looking at the overall developmental needs of the sector going forward. We also advocated a more centralised collection and analysis of data in order to, again, to facilitate effective monitoring of the construction sector output and market conditions. So what now? Well, a very positive development was at the time of publication of our report, the government issued a detailed government statement on the construction sector in response to the Forfás recommendations. And two important commitments within that statement were that first of all, that the Cabinet Committee on Economic Recovery and Jobs would focus specifically on the construction sector on a quarterly basis. And also a commitment to establish a new construction sector consultation and coordination group as a forum for engagement with the industry. And there was also a commitment to action on a number of areas in that statement, again reflecting many of the recommendations within the Forfás report. For example, a commitment to continue to implement the public capital programme as set out, to progress initiatives with IDA Ireland in terms of securing investment in the required office and industrial properties and to remove any blockages there, to build on progress in securing alternative financing solutions for investment in areas of strategic importance to Ireland. And a recent development there was, for example, a €200 million committed from the National Lottery licence transaction to be invested in the coming years. The intensification of efforts to combat shadow economy activity, the register of approved contractors would be part of that. That's an initiative also announced at the same time. And also a commitment to undertake consumer-targeted communications on the shadow economy. Again, to develop innovative financing mechanisms to get energy efficiency programs moving. Also to undertake a review of the government contract, and that process has commenced, and engagement has commenced with the industry in relation to that process, which is led by the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform. And also the government is committed to examine the issue of performance bonds for private contracts, and the Department of Public Expenditure is already engaged with the industry in relation to performance bonds in the public contracts. So, as I said, it's a rolling agenda, and I hope the start of a new phase in Irish construction. We need to continue to work together to accelerate recovery and to realise the ambition for a competitive and sustainable sector over the longer term. And I know that this conference makes an important statement in that respect, and it has a critical role in driving innovation, the innovation and capability agenda. And I wish you very well in your conference, and thanks for listening.